Good evening, everyone. I hereby call to order the August special meeting of the Hermosa Beach Planning Commission. If everyone could stand and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right, thank you. May we have the roll call, please?
Yes. Commissioner Rice,
Here.
Commissioner Simon,
Here.
Commissioner Hoffman,
Here.
Vice Chair Izant,
Here.
and Chair Peterson,
Here.
all here.
All right, thank you. At this point, we will have our public participation for tonight. It's worth noting that this is a special meeting. Our only topic is on the zoning code update. We're not taking action or a vote on anything tonight, but regardless, we do always take public comments. So if anyone wishes to speak at this time, I will kick it over to staff for some legalese, and then they can call on people either over the phone or Zoom rather, or in person.
Although the Planning Commission values your comments, the Brown Act generally prohibits the Planning Commission from acting on any matter not listed on the posted agenda as a business item. This is the time for members of the public to address the Planning Commission on any items within the Commission's jurisdiction, not on this agenda or items on this agenda. Please note that the Planning Commission does not engage in a dialogue during public comment, and each speaker is limited to 3 minutes per speaker. If you are joining the meeting by phone, please remember to dial *6 in order to unmute yourself. Participants joining by internet, please remember to unmute and please state your name for the record before starting your comment.
All right, do we have anyone here that wishes to speak? If you do, come forward. And then we'll go to the Zoom. Please state your name and sign in if you could.
It's Brian Dunn. I'm a resident of Hermosa Beach. And also we have a store up on Pacific Coast Highway called Details Tile and Stone. And it replaced Classic Tile, which was there for 30 years. My wife runs it. She does a great job. And we deal with a lot of the contractors, developers, investors around town in the whole South Bay area. I want to thank very much Melanie Hall and Francis Estrada for helping in getting a building permit for us. We bought a home on 25th and Ardmore and going to remodel it and put an ADU in it. So they were very helpful, and it took a long time, but I know the hard work that they're going through is really appreciated. I also want to say, I want to thank the residents of Hermosa Beach and the government of 100 years ago. The city was founded in 1907, and then we saw a wonderful spread of new construction going on. At the Surf and Surf Club, which is turned into the Biltmore Hotel, the bank where Bank of America is right now, the first banking institution, the Bijou Theater, the school up on Pier. All of these things were going on, and we have all enjoyed the benefits of those over the last 80 years, so 100 years, I should say, adding some time to it. I would like to say that the city has to look at new ways of bringing money into town. I was at the meeting here a week or so ago with the city council about the taxes that they were thinking of raising, and everybody was against it. And of course, we all see in the public comments about recession. And so we're going to have to find ways of bringing in money for this city as we grow in the 21st century. So please, new construction should be something that we all address. And I really appreciate the review of the zoning that's going to go on tonight. I will be learning from it. So I look forward to it. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Brian, and for your work with our EDC. Thank you, sir. Do we have anyone else in person that wishes to speak? Seeing none. Jonathan, do we have anyone on the line for public comment? I can't see them.
At this time, no one has their hand raised on Zoom. If you wish to speak and address the planning commission, please raise your hand. We have 2 attendees who wish to speak. At this time, Laura, you may address the planning commission. Please unmute yourself and begin your time.
Hello, this is Laura. Can you hear me?
Yes, Laura.
Hi, I want to thank the commissioners, staff, and especially Martha Miller for all their work with these design standards. As a stakeholder in the Economic Development Advisory Group, we have been discussing how to create more vibrancy in our commercial zones for the last 2 years. We conducted a SWOT analysis highlighting our strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. This information should be utilized as a frame of reference. Hermosa's culture celebrates and relishes its eclectic architecture that was so clearly pointed out during our last meeting. Our commercial downtown is the heart of our city. So in order to retain the character while incentivizing reinvestment, we need to be able to depend on clear standards with enough flexibility that makes financial sense. If we opt to continue with just doing this bare minimum to reflect the city's current practices and development patterns, you will see the same, no development. As you review these recommendations, please ask yourself how these will provide economic vibrancy and action in 2 categories. 1, reinvestment into existing properties. As we all know, a lot of the buildings in our commercial districts have not been updated in decades. We need to think about how we can remove those barriers. For example, most of you know that the outdoor dining decks have been incredibly amazing for vibrancy. The ability to eat with our exceptional weather is one of our strengths. But currently, if a business wanted to create a garage style full opening to bring the outdoors in, they cannot. The current open air dining isn't even defined in our municipal code. A business tried to incorporate this modern design and was told that they could only do it to 50% of their frontage. Let's change that. In the supplemental standards for Pier Avenue, if we wanted to add 500 square feet, we would have to add a bench visible and accessible to the sidewalk. This doesn't make sense given our sidewalk space, our parking meters, our trees, our bike racks. It'd be a great idea if we had incorporated it into our upper pier revitalization, but it should be removed. The second area is new development potential. As Brian was clearly stating, again, remove barriers. As stated in the staff report, FARs are not part of the zone in update project. As I understand, it would take an amendment to our general plan, which is not part of the scope, but shouldn't it be? Plan Hermosa is a living document that can be updated 4 times per year. If we are recommending the formation of a new downtown zone, then FAR should be addressed by council. If we have any impact on improving our economic development, we should leave no stone unturned. As noted on page 27 of our assessment report, a well-designed city directly evaluates the quality of life, which can attract investment and increase communal pride. One other area where we could enhance is in the OS zone. As listed on page 16, improvements are extremely limited. We can add benches to Noble Park to view the ocean, but again, our SWOT analysis said that it could be a great area for placemaking, adding tables, shade coverings. I leave with one final thought. As I read in the staff report, only 2 members of our business process ad hoc group provided feedback. As a business advisory member in the city, I implore you to reach out to the Chamber's Economic Action Committee if you need assistance with getting expert feedback in any of these industries. We need to continue to work together because it truly takes a village. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Laura. Jonathan, do we have anyone else that wishes to speak?
Yes. At this time, John Davis, please state your name for the record, unmute yourself, and address the commissioners.
Yes, hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can, John.
Wonderful. So my name is John David, and I just wanted to thank you all for your public service. This includes the commissioners, staff, Martha Miller, and every resident that gets involved, every resident in business that gets involved. You know, today I just want to speak on the topic of design and district standards, which we're discussing tonight. Hermosa's character is so special. It's the eclectic nature that makes it so special. And I think in order to retain that, we need to really focus on design flexibility. People choose where they live, where they dine, how they shop, where they shop, based on how it makes them feel. So any kind of overly prescriptive design standards would rob that special feeling. So I think Commissioner Hoffman had brought up something similar, and I just want to reiterate that, and hope you carry that theme throughout. As it relates to that, is I also want to just avoid unnecessary limitations. To me, the ceiling height on the ground floor is an unnecessary limitation. I think we need to let the designers design. There's a brand new, I'm sure you guys know about it, but a new construction right next to the Stanton, and it's got ground floor retail, and I think it's 2 levels of office. This could add a lot of vibrancy to that area, and I don't think it ever could have been built if they were told they have to have a certain ground floor minimum. So that would have been something we missed as a city by doing that. I also think the same applies to floor to area ratios. They're very limiting, and practically they really don't have a benefit. We already have a 30-foot height restriction, which serves to limit the scale of the buildings, and I think that's what we're looking for in terms of character retention. But we don't really need FARs. The 30-foot already does that. I did send each of you a diagram that I poorly drew up, but it does show you what it looks like if you're on, say, Pier Avenue or Hermosa Avenue, looking at a building that's a 1.25 FAR, a 1.5 FAR, and a 2.5 FAR, and they're very similar. They really don't feel too big. They feel the same as you walk by, but the higher FAR increases the vibrancy and helps the local economy by making the properties more usable. So I do ask that, I know you can't do anything about it, but I do ask that you suggest to City Council that they relook at FARs, if needed, do an environmental impact report, and put an amendment into the general plan. I think at the very least, this should be discussed, and I know on your own you can't carry it forward. Also, last thing is, Martha Miller's presentation references a modification process and suggests giving more authority to community director to make some decisions. And I think that's a really great idea. I appreciate you guys, but I've seen so many great improvements fall by the wayside because of the cost and effort of going in front of the planning commission. So it would be nice if she had some more authority to get things done. So that's all I have to say. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Okay, thank you, John. Jonathan, do we have anyone else in the queue?
At this time, there is no one else with their hand raised.
Okay, dramatic pause. At this point, we will close public comment, oral participation. Now turn to written communication. I believe we had 2 written communications. Do I have a motion to receive and file?
Chair, so moved.
Second. We have a motion and a second. Can we have a vote on that?
Commissioner Rice,
Yes.
Commissioner Samon,
Yes.
Commissioner Hoffman,
Yes.
Vice Chair Eisent,
Yes.
Chair Peterson.
Yes.
Motion passes.
All right, thank you. We'll now move on to item 5, a review and discussion. First item A is just a information item specific to our public notice that was appropriately given for this meeting. Moving on to item B, this is our comprehensive zone code update, district and design standards. It's why we're here tonight. I see Martha Miller, who's going to lead us through this. Just a quick comment. Our charter for tonight is to receive the staff presentation, solicit public comment, and then provide feedback as a group. So I'll defer to staff in terms of how the presentation is done. I just want to make sure that we don't have too much debate up here before we hear from the public, but at the same time, if we have any clarifying comments or questions to staff during the presentation, feel free. So Jeannie, are you going to lead us, or should I go straight to Martha?
You can go ahead and go straight to Martha.
All right, Martha, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. It's good to be back. I'm gonna Hopefully I'm sharing the right screen, the presentation slides.
Yes.
Okay, great. So it's good to be back, kind of revisiting or continuing the conversation on the preliminary draft district and design standards, kind of following up to our study session in July. And the setup is different for me, so I have to figure out how to advance my slides. So bear with me for a second here. Okay, so as a reminder, and then for people who are just joining us, the overall project is an update to the zoning and subdivision ordinances to create a user-friendly set of regulations to implement the vision for the community articulated in Plan Hermosa, which is the city's general plan. We started the project back in February of 2020 with an assessment of your current ordinances, and that resulted in an assessment report and a work plan for moving forward with the update. And that's what we're in the midst of now, is actually doing the update. And in doing that, we broke the code down into about 4 sections to help kind of facilitate review as we start working on updating the standards. So we reviewed the draft use regulations at 2 study sessions with the Planning Commission, and those are available on the project website for anybody to review, to comment, to ask questions of staff. But our current discussion is on the draft district and design standards, and this is the follow-up to our study session in July. Just some things that we wanted to verify that we heard correctly, follow up with some information, and continue the discussion. From here, we'll go into city-wide standards and administrative provisions, review those with you at study sessions, then revise them all, package them together into a complete draft ordinance. And then we'll go through the review process again. So it is an iterative process, but as we said, we like to get as much input and information as we can as early in the process. So the district and design standards contain development standards for each zoning district within the city. It includes building design standards, which are objective design standards for different building types, including single unit, multi-unit, and non-residential development. There's general site regulations, which are standards that apply to general site features such as landscaping, fencing, lighting. And then there's rules of measurement, which really establish the kind of mechanisms for measuring or implementing the standard. So how height is measured, how setbacks are measured, and so on. And I mentioned that the zoning is really intended to implement Plan Hermosa. And so we wanted to take this opportunity to highlight some of the relevant land use policies in Plan Hermosa that relate specifically to the design and district standards. So I want to pass it back to staff to kind of give an overview of some of those policy direction.
Thank you, Martha. So Plan Hermosa, the land use element policies, especially goal number 5, applies to the district and design standards. Goal 5 states quality and authenticity in architecture and site design in all construction and renovation of buildings. And Goal 5 includes the 6 policies listed: scale and massing. Consider the scale of new development within its urban context to avoid abrupt changes in scale and massing. Also, high quality materials, locally appropriate materials, unique brand and identity, preservation and adaptive reuse, and eclectic and diverse architecture. So it's important that we remember that the zoning code update, specifically the district and design standards, correspond with this land use element policy.
So we,
All right.
we just keep those in mind as we develop the draft of the standards and as we discuss them. So we summarized what we thought we heard at the last study session and wanted to kind of go through each one of these, and I'll go through them all in the presentation, but I want to kind of highlight the either verification or continued discussion we want for each of those. Some of them just might be, you know, yes, you heard us correctly, or no, you didn't, and move on. And then others will ask for some more input. But the first item that we heard regarded a provision for additional height allowance in the RH zone. So this is a discretionary allowance for additional height in the residential high density zone. And in the draft standards, we recommended removing that since it wasn't often used and it wasn't often approved through the process. So we thought of it as a cleanup. What we heard through the study session was that although it may not often be used, it was intended for a specific purpose to address some limited, unique situations that may still exist, and that it would be appropriate to keep that provision in. The second item we heard from one of the speakers tonight is about the commercial zone ground floor height limit, which the draft standards included a 14-foot minimum ground floor height in the commercial zones. We heard that was too restrictive and not really appropriate given the overall height limitations in the commercial zone, and that it was really too restrictive and just not appropriate for the development pattern. The third is about the allowable floor area ratio in downtown. And this was a discussion that maybe a different FAR may be appropriate in the downtown, and to look at considering that. And again, as others have mentioned, that floor area ratio is established in Plan Hermosa, and that's really a measure of development intensity that is allowed to happen. So if you were to increase the allowable FAR, that really requires a general plan amendment, and that is subject to environmental review. As again, that FAR is a factor in intensity of development, and that's a factor in calculating the build out and potential environmental impacts. So if you're increasing it, you would have to do that analysis to ensure that it's either accounted for in the EIR analysis, or if there's any additional impacts, environmental impacts associated with that, that those are addressed appropriately. So any increase in FAR, it would necessitate a general plan amendment as well as environmental review. And that's really something that the city could do as a separate effort. We also heard that there was interest in hearing from local designers, architects, builders on the proposed standards and whether they were appropriate. So I'm going to pass it back to staff again to kind of give a summary of the actions that were taken to try and get this input, and then the result of those actions.
Thank you, Martha. Upon feedback from the Planning Commission, staff ramped up outreach to the design and development community specifically to obtain feedback on the district and design standards. Staff sent multiple emails and made personal phone calls requesting feedback. Staff also hosted a workshop with the Business Process Improvement Ad Hoc Committee. Staff also posted the handouts at the counter. Between these efforts, staff received very limited feedback. There was 2 participants that were at the meeting, and just limited feedback on the individual phone calls that we have made as well. Thanks, Martha.
So I kind of combined items 5 and 6 for discussion. So these are the actual design standards, and as well as the modification process. So in developing the building design standards, and these are intended to be objective design standards that are intended to ensure appropriate and quality development in a manner that is measurable and knowable by kind of all parties looking at it. So everybody has the same interpretation of what those standards are. And that concept in itself is, in addition to the design policies in Plan Hermosa, the policies related to transparency and good governance are also related to this. So when it's kind of clear what the standards are and everybody has the same interpretation of the standards and they're implemented consistently, that's part of a transparent kind of process and good governance. So that's also consistent with those policies in Plan Hermosa, as well as state law. So there's been a number of housing legislation that has been passed, which kind of increasingly limits jurisdiction's ability to have discretion over certain projects, particularly certain housing developments. And increasingly, the allowance for review is limited to clear and objective standards. So there's kind of a couple of reasons why the city is interested in having objective design standards, both local policy reasons, but also consistency with state law. So the objective design standards would apply to single unit development, multi-unit development, and non-residential development. And the intention of the standards as they were drafted was really intended to accommodate a variety of building styles and architectural styles, while addressing some universal elements of design. So still allowing for that eclectic character to come out, but recognizing that there's some kind of key elements of design that no matter what the style is, those all add to quality design. And then to also allow for flexibility, both to accommodate those variety of styles, but then to also consider alternatives, so creative design solutions. So to set the standard, but at the same time, allow for flexibility in how that standard is met, either by a menu of options or by a discretionary kind of approval where you can consider a whole different approach to it. So overall, it's like establish kind of a reasonable and an effective kind of base requirement, but then allow that alternative process to consider alternatives that meet that same design intent. Before I get into the standard, I'm gonna skip to the concept of that modification process, because there are some kind of questions on that, how it would work, what would the timing be with it. So I'm gonna describe the overall process and then pass it back to staff to kind of relate some of their similar experiences or how this would actually work when a project or request came in. So the concept for the modification process is to be a director approval, unless the project is for some other reason going to a higher review body, such as the Planning Commission. Then it would all be packaged into one decision-making action. But the concept is to have a lower kind of level of review. So it's a director approval. It is a discretionary action though. So findings must be made and conditions of approval may be applied. And that's why in the standards, when it identifies that a modification is allowed for a certain standard, it attempts to put in the parameters under which that decision would be made, or what the director in making the decision is looking for, whether it's a welcoming feature or whether it's articulation or a reduction in massing. So findings must be made, conditions may be applied, the director's decision is appealable to the Planning Commission, whether that be by the applicant themselves or by a neighbor or another interested party. If there's something that seems particularly controversial, the director can refer an application to the Planning Commission. But again, these are intended to really be available to allow consideration of alternatives that, it's not a one size fit all in the standard. And the parameters for that consideration are intended to kind of categorize the design intent and what that alternative approach kind of should meet in that, and would help the director with the review and also the applicant with with the proposal. So again, I'll pass it to staff to kind of describe kind of a similar process or experience with a similar process.
Great, thank you, Martha. So in past jurisdictions, I've seen this handled where the public is still involved, is still somewhat of a public process, a transparent process by which an application is submitted to the department. Notices are sent out to a certain radius, whether that be 300 feet or 500 feet from the property. A staff memo is posted on the website along with the plans. 10 days are provided for comment. If no comment is received, either objections or support, then the director can go ahead and make that decision. And then upon notice of that decision, a mailing would again be sent out to the radius mailing, and a 20-day appeal period would apply for that application. So I've seen that's the way it's been handled in 2 other jurisdictions where I've worked. And it still allows for kind of that reduced process, but still involves the community and allows for that public input and transparency. So that's one way that it could be handled, but we're certainly looking for direction from the Planning Commission on whether or not they think a process like this would be acceptable.
So the first set of standards are for single unit development. And one thing, or what we heard at the last study session, was concerns of potentially that these standards may be too prescriptive, and that for single unit development, really you have people designing their homes that are very personal and, you know, reflective of their lifestyle or their desires, or they're architecturally designed. And so there should be a lot of freedom, design freedom with that. So when we go through this, I think we'd like to hear which standards, if any, are appropriate to kind of retain and carry forward for single unit development, whether they're all felt too prescriptive and not necessary, or if there's certain ones. But again, these were drafted with the intention to not overly regulate and not be too prescriptive, to focus on kind of the key elements of design and to offer different mechanisms for having compliance with those standards. And on the slide are just some pictures where we tried to show that different situations, different styles of homes, different lot sizes, that all of those meet the design requirements. So again, they are intended to accommodate a wide variety of designs and personal expression, while kind of addressing some key elements of design. The second group of standards is for multi-unit development. And multi-unit development is a little different than single unit development in that typically, or more often, you may have a developer developing these units, or a rental agency or developer also managing them and renting out units. So you have a little bit less of that kind of personal expression or customization to kind of personal ways of life or of living in there. So it's a little different in some respects. But what the standards do is, again, the same kind of idea is not to overregulate and force a specific design, but ensure that designs that come forward all have kind of these key elements that help create the character in Hermosa Beach that you're looking for. So the picture is an example of a development that doesn't meet the draft entrance or window design requirements. And that's not to say a development like this couldn't happen. It's under the standards. If somebody came in and wanted to build something like this, they would go through the modification process to ask for a modification to those design requirements. But similar with the single unit development standards, we'd like to hear the same thing with the multi-unit development standards. Which, if any, of the draft standards are appropriate, understanding your concerns and desires to not be too prescriptive and really be able to enable construction and investment. So this is the second slide. There's continued on the types of standards. And then these pictures of different scales of multi-unit development all meet the design requirements. Again, intended to show that a wide variety of types of development and styles of development are still enabled under the draft standards. The final set of standards is for commercial or non-residential development, and we broke these out into the downtown zone and other commercial corridors. And this slide has some schematics of development that meet all of the design standards and kind of point out that the topic areas that the design standards apply to. So the draft standards for this area in the downtown zone, they aren't really new. So they update, clarify, and simplify your existing SPA 11 standards, which my understanding is those were developed for kind of a previous very kind of targeted design exercise for this area and for Pier Avenue. So these aren't necessarily new. Again, they update, they clarify, they simplify those existing standards that really target kind of those key elements of design and also placemaking. So as you get into more of the commercial zones, there's a kind of this other level of interest that you have that's not just pure as much kind of private property and personal style of living. This is your public space. This is, a key corridor of your community. So the placemaking interest comes in as well as the private development interest or that private tenant's interest. So there's kind of a balance in there. But the design standards address the entrances, transparency at the ground floor level, the how kind of fine-grained the development is, and that's all to reflect that established character that you have in your downtown zone and along Pier Avenue. For the other commercial corridors, they don't have the same micro grained standards that Pier Avenue does currently. There are throughout Plan Hermosa policy direction for pedestrian orientation, maximizing transparency, parking location, have buildings located close to the street, having a regular storefront rhythm. So the standards address all of those, modified to kind of fit these more commercial oriented corridors. So the actual requirements are kind of different than Pier Avenue in recognition of the different character there. But again, that policy direction is taken from Plan Hermosa and the character districts that you have in Plan Hermosa. So again, with the non-residential development, we have the same questions as single unit and multi-unit, kind of which, if any, of the standards are appropriate and appropriate to carry forward. And then we just, if there was anything else that was covered at the study session or you wanted to cover tonight that we didn't cover in the presentation, we wanted to make sure there's opportunity for that. And that concludes my presentation.
Okay, thank you very much. I know we'll have some comments. We'll probably go section by section. I think first it would be good to take public comment if anyone wishes to speak now. If anyone in the chambers wishes to speak, we will defer to you. If not, we'll see if anyone online wishes to.
Got a couple of comments.
Okay, that's fine. I'm trying to remember. I know you can't take 2 bites of the apple. I can't remember if your initial comments were on the presentation.
Those are general comments. These are more addressed at.
I think that's fine.
Yeah,
I think that's fine.
And to Chair Peterson, typically that 2 bites of the apple kind of, plays into quasi judicial due process issues because
Okay.
here, this is just a study session. It's best to err on the
Yeah.
side of caution and let them speak.
Okay.
Okay, there's one place that I know is available on PCH, and what you do, the first thing is find out what the FAR is. the lot's 20 feet, 20,000 square feet. And, if it's one, you can build a building of 20,000 square feet. And if you're getting $4 per square foot per month, times 48 for 12 months, you find out what your maximum income, the rental income could be. And then you figure out how much it costs to build the product. And therefore, you're coming up with a valuation of what you might be able. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. You look at the FAR, you look at the rent, what you can get over a 12-month period. You find out how much it is to build the subject property, $250 a square foot maybe. And then you can figure out what the land you can pay for the property. So FAR is very important in valuing a piece of property. When it comes to units there's in the residential, there was no distinction between 1 to 4 units and 5 units and more. And that's the usual way you separate things. Traditionally, the older units, if it's 4 units, they're 4 different things, 2 on the ground floor separated in the middle, and then 2 on the top floor separated in the middle. And so that's how traditionally it's 1 to 4 units. And then anything above that, it's commercial. And I didn't see any reference to that difference in the thing. And those are my 2 comments. So thank you very much.
Okay. Awesome, thank you. Anyone else? Jonathan, do we have anyone via Zoom that wishes to speak?
At this time, no one has their hand raised. If you're attending via Zoom, please raise your hand at this time to address the commission.
Anyone?
No one raised their hand.
Okay, given that, we'll close the public comment on this item. We do appreciate public participation. Thank you. At this point, I'll bring it back up here. My sense is ultimately we're here to give clear feedback, maybe not unanimous feedback, but to Martha so that she can continue through this. So do you want to go, I'm guessing item by item and just kind of see where we're at? Does that make most sense?
Sure, I can bring the slides back up.
Yeah, I think some of these will be quicker than others. So item 1 specific to discretionary allowance. I believe that captures our consensus. This one I was sort of on the fence about. I could either take it or leave it. Does anyone have any comments on this? Does this fairly represent either our thoughts of last time or tonight, if anyone has a change of heart?
Mr. Chair.
We're on item 1, height allowance, RH zone. Yes, sir. Mr. Seaman.
Thank you. I do have a question about this in particular. Pardon me. I know that we want to retain the discretionary allowance. I'm for that, of course, and as I spoke last time. But I had a question about that discretionary allowance itself. Most recently, we had one, I think, on First Street or Second Street. It was with this issue, and the finding about light and air was part of that discretionary allowance. And I'm curious where that came from, because I know originally when that was written, it did not have any allowance for air and light. And I'm curious how and where that came from. And would it be possible to remove that finding from this item? Is that too deep into this? For
No,
this
that's fine.
particular
That's fine.
discussion? I mean, if it's something we should discuss at some other point, that's fine. But while we're talking about this particular thing, and if we're going to keep it, that was just something that sort of bothered me when we had the discussion in the first place, particularly that particular issue. The houses in that on that question were oriented the lengthwise north-south. And of course, we all know the sun comes up and down in the southern hemisphere. And so light and air would have virtually no difference between a 30-foot building or a 32-foot building and so on and so forth. And I'm just curious as to where that came from, because years and years and years ago, I was one of the first people to get that exception to the height as a contractor. It was actually as a homeowner, I was building my own home at the time. And light and air was not even a question about it. It was a question of how many buildings there are around you that are 30 foot tall and so on and so forth. So the requirements were different then. And somewhere between then and now, light and air between the buildings has been added to that question. So I'm just want to bring this up now while we're talking about it and see, you know, how did that happen? And is that written in stone and can it be changed?
I don't know when it was written. I'm sure it can be changed if we choose to. I happen to like it the way it's written.
Okay.
But I'm just one guy with a vote. Pete, I looked to Pete because he probably our historian here.
Well, the thing that I was thinking as we said this in my own notes here, I think in the time I've been on the commission, we've done this 3 times. And I can't remember, I think we've turned it down consistently. And I think Rob's question and others, as it comes up, there is that property, and there's some properties that run north-south, there's some that run east-west. Which side is the taller pre-existing non-conforming structure probably plays into that, and probably even more so now with solar issues and so on. So but it comes up so rarely, I think we can handle this kind of on a item by item case probably.
And leave the light and air issue as applicable.
Does anyone else have thoughts on this?
Chair Peterson, I would support the current language as written.
Okay. Commissioner Rice?
Thank you, Chair. I'll agree with my 2 colleagues to my left. I think we should retain the discretionary allowance as written in the RH zone.
Okay. And
Okay, fair enough.
okay, and I'll point out to those when we talk about height, this applies to a very small number of homes in a very specific district. So if you hear height, discretion, et cetera, again, this is not this is not in your neighborhood, chances are. All right, Martha, I think that's clear communication or direction for you. Moving on to item 2, if you could. There you are, you already did it. A commercial zone ground floor height. I think you've captured the essence of our discussion last time. I'll open it to the commissioners if anyone has any comments on it. I'll just add that the primary question was not so much the 14-foot, but the implications of having 2 versus 3 floors in a 30-foot zone. So are there any comments on this or further thoughts?
It was a question more than a comment. I believe at some part, and I apologize, but in the report, it makes reference to the existing standard. Is there a minimum existing standard other than 8 feet or whatever it is that?
In SPA 11, which is along Pier Avenue, I believe the minimum height is 12 feet.
Okay, so we would make that a citywide standard. Is that what you're suggesting?
Well, you could retain that in the downtown zone. I also think you could get rid of the minimum ground floor height standard altogether, because just kind of with the heights,
right,
somebody building it's going to have to make decisions on how to fit everything they need to fit in there. So,
and I would argue that Martha's exactly right, that we ought to eliminate it. And one of the things that occurred to me is if I was building a restaurant, I might want a 12 or 14, I might want a 20-foot in the front, but in the back in the kitchen, 8 feet might be more than I need, or 10 or whatever. So I think if we can sort of allow flexibility here, it's probably the appropriate thing to do.
Okay.
I would support elimination. Excuse me, Chair Peterson, I would support elimination.
Okay. Commissioner Rice?
Same here. Let's eliminate it.
Okay. Commissioner Seaman?
I agree. No minimum.
Okay. Very good. That was easy. All right. On to item 3, FIR downtown. I know you gave us some additional clarification on that. I mean, I'm not sure what direction we can give you on this. This is sort of beyond the scope of tonight's conversation around zoning because it would require a plan amendment. So you have any other thoughts on this, Martha, or anyone, any of my colleagues, Vice Chair, if you want to jump in, get the hot hand there?
Chair Peterson, I think at the last meeting, there was a general consensus amongst all the commissioners that this should either be modified or even possibly eliminated. Clearly now, however, though, it's not something that we can do under the scope of what we've been charged to do. So, but I would like to pursue it in the proper way. And so I would ask either Director Naughton or Councilor Donegan, how do we do that? Do we have a consensus that we then send a request to the city council, or is it something that we can formulate and send that to the city council? I realize we have to do it separate and apart from all the things we're doing here, but I would like to proceed on this, but in the proper manner.
Okay. Yeah, I had questions and thoughts about it. I don't know if there was unanimity of the group, but it might be something to bring back. Like I said, I have a lot of questions. It's always about the consequences, unintended consequences, and sort of, you know, looking at how it plays out in the built environment. So does anyone else have any thoughts on that? It might make sense to bring that back at some point to a planning commission meeting for a discussion of something that would feed into a city council action if we in fact think it's the right thing to do. But
I would suggest that when we're done with this, there may be other items that then when we finally move to sort of approve this or recommend approval to the council, that it come with a list of these are items that are remaining that we'd like to consider. And this would certainly be maybe at the top of that list. But I just suspect there are going to be other things that may show up by the time we get done here.
yeah, I could support that. Okay, so if we can put some sort of sticky note on that, staff, to bring that back at some point. Rob, do you have any other comments on this or? any
No,
thoughts?
I agree.
Okay,
So do I, Chair. So we'll make a list of things
all right.
go through the process.
All right, fantastic. Thank you, everyone. Moving on to item number 4, local designer input. I mean, I had questions of this. I was just, I don't know, sad, disappointed, whatever, curious in terms of what we need to do to get more input. There were a lot of questions specifically around the items 5 and 6, the design standards, whether it was being too prescriptive, whether it would inhibit development, be viewed as red tape, or whether it would in fact in some ways kind of streamline things for development in terms of understanding what a, you know, a Hermosa Beach house is laid out like. So I'm curious of staff, like what next steps are in this or what the dynamic is. Any thoughts or any other thoughts from my fellow commissioners? This one was kind of a bummer. Yeah. Although I understand volunteers are volunteers, as are we, and time is precious. So I just
Sure.
love to hear more feedback.
Chair Peterson, I would echo your thoughts on. I'm disappointed. It appears that the response, it does appear that staff has done a good job of trying to reach out to these particular groups. I guess the only question I would ask is, are there any other groups? Is this something that we should have asked the chamber to broadcast? Is this something that we should have done with a downtown working group? This is a momentous thing. We're not going to do, I'm not going to be on the planning commission the next time we do this. And so I'm disappointed at the lack of public support or input, and especially from the business community. So how else can we reach out?
Commissioner Rice?
Thank you, Chair and Vice Chair, for your comments. It was a little surprising, especially since we did reach out to development and construction professionals. This is more than just the commercial development standards, it's residential. So I feel like we have heard from the Economic Development Subcommittee that you were on. They've certainly weighed in. We've heard tonight. And so I think my questions are more around, I see the effort that was made in terms of putting together a menu of options. There's a little more description of the modification process, but it still leaves me with a lot of questions. And the more I sit and think about this, this is an attempt to put standards around development so we keep the eclectic nature that we have, which is eclectic because we have no design standards. And so for me, that's where sort of the intersection is really hard. And I appreciate the sort of, welcoming exterior. It can have certain elements. It can be a window frame, it could be recessed, or modification process. And to me, a project could end up, the entire thing could be in modification process. And so that goes to the time spent by staff, also by the homeowner, the property owner, the developer, the commercial property owner or developer. And so I think for me, where I sit today is that I would almost rather see a list of what we do not want to happen, rather than tell people, here's how we want you to prevent that from happening. So if we mean to say a facade must have articulation, then we should just say that and let the designer, the architect, the builder, the homeowner, the property developer decide, is it the fenestration? Is it a window? Is it a door? Is it different kinds of architectural elements, rather than having this very prescriptive list. I looked at my own home today, which is a streamlined, modern 29 special. And we kept a lot of the elements and we enhanced some of them, but I can tell you my windows are not recessed 2 inches, although my framing is 2.5, right? So I think, and that we try to be creative and keep the style of the home, but update it at the same time. And we had the flexibility to do that because we didn't have to hit some of these standards. I happen to think we did a pretty good job. Others can disagree. And we kept the scale and the massing because we really didn't make it any bigger. So it allowed us to work with our little house and be creative and keep the character we loved and just tweak it a little bit. So for me, I think that hits the sweet spot of where we're trying to get. I also think it would be less of a workload for staff. So Jeannie, anywhere you've worked or any other cities, have you seen where we just say, we do not want every 10 feet, there has to be an articulation, or just say what we don't want it to be and then not have the rest of this?
Can I just jump in for a minute? We've sort of migrated from 0.4 to 5 and 6 a little bit. That's okay.
I had to get there because
That's
we heard that there is no local designer input.
Exactly. So but is there any other way to do that? Is there any other, yeah, Christy?
Thank you. I just want to summarize a little bit the feedback that we did receive.
Okay.
We conducted a meeting with our business process group. It's an ad hoc group that we've gathered a couple times before. That was something the city manager wanted to do to help us streamline processes. And so we invited them again to talk about this, and we sent them all the materials, and maybe of our 12 members, only 2 members attended, but we did receive feedback from those 2 members. One member is a high-end custom construction contractor, and he builds a lot of single family and small residential units. And he said that his customers want to build something nice, that this would not be an impediment, but was concerned about additional costs that might be mandated through the process. And then the other member was a project manager of different projects, and she said she was concerned about costs, period, that we shouldn't have anything that creates additional costs. But the feedback generally was, for single family, it was less of a big deal than for commercial or for multifamily. So we wanted to relay you with the few comments that we did receive.
And do we think we can, is it a matter of time to get more comments? Do we need to ask different people that are, to me, the specific focus was, is this going to be an impediment to buildings? That's a contractor and an architect question. Do we have any thoughts on how to get more feedback, or we just kind of got what we got?
The contractor generally didn't think that that was an issue.
Okay.
Because his clients want to build high quality in Hermosa Beach in the South Bay.
Okay. All right. Well, I would just, if anyone else has thoughts, I just implore staff to continue to.
Only comment I would add, it's interesting to me that we had 3 members of the public speak today all three members were part of the stakeholders group from the Economic Development Committee. That's a group of folks who are engaged, and not to take exception to some of the things that Martha said, but I can guarantee you Ron Newman, for example, takes the design of his restaurants as seriously as it does his home, and is just as concerned about the aesthetics and the limitations that might be imposed, so that someone like that or Mr. Dunn, again, I'm sure would have a different perspective on how personal they take the decisions and how those would affect those that would go beyond the economics is the obvious thing. I think we all anticipate that. And just adding into it this process of appeal or whatever we want to call it, you might say that doesn't cost anything. Yeah, did it cost me a month worth of carrying costs on my project, which might be thousands of dollars. And so I don't think we can ignore that cost part of this, but I think we certainly need to be sensitive to the fact that, well.
Okay, we'll officially move to items 5 and 6. No, that's okay. We're a flexible group. All right. Yeah, there's a lot to chew on here.
So maybe we start if there's any questions or any discussion on the modification process, and then maybe we can go through each set of standards.
Bingo. Yeah, that's what I was going to suggest. So you beat me to the punch.
Oh, sorry.
No, that's okay. Great minds think alike. Who wishes to jump in? I certainly have thoughts, but I'll defer to my colleagues if they want to jump in on this, specifically to the modification process. So this would be appeal of changes to the exact standard, I guess, for that.
I'd be happy to start.
Yes,
I guess, if you
have at it.
And I guess that some of the questions or issues, as Marie kind of jump-started our conversation on this, I'll be honest with you, Martha, I still don't understand it. And Ms. Naughton, I don't understand the process at all. And I'm still concerned. There are certain items that come in front of us that have objective standards. The most obvious one is a convex slope determination. That's a very objective standard. And yet the director has, at least as a matter of practice, always brought that to us, because even though the definition of convex is that's an objective standard, it becomes subjective at which point that is significantly convex. And so it's always been brought here. I don't understand. This is a purely aesthetic set of standards. I don't understand what it mentions here, the findings what possible finding can we impose upon the director to make a determination that in fact, in this particular home, because again, purely arbitrary 2-inch molding, our contractor can tell us nominal wood isn't 2 inches wide. Nominal wood is 1.5 inches, unless you're using certain kinds of plastic wood and composite materials. So what you're really saying is you got to use a 2x, or you got to cut. I don't know what this, it's a purely arbitrary thing. I don't understand what a welcoming feature is when it's defined as 30 square feet or the minimum. I walked by 3 units here on the way tonight, looked, the welcoming stoop has to be 6 by 8. There's a 6 by 8. They would have to move their house back 3 feet to get 6 feet in the setback for their property line. And I'm still trying to understand what it is that's appealable, other than she thinks, with all due respect, she thinks it's attractive. Rob and I and Steve don't. I don't get the process. And the question of, and this maybe goes to, if you come to me and you live up in some of the parts of PV and you don't want a red tile roof, I'm sorry, that's an objective aesthetic standard in a sense. I'm still grappling, and I'm trying honestly to try and come out of this with this. Okay, we don't want chain link fences in Hermosa, prohibited. We don't want blank walls that are more than, pick a number, 10 feet, 15 feet, 20. we could agree on that. I don't know that I'm prepared to say that 30 feet of square feet of projection, 30 feet of square, 6x8 stoop, 2-inch setback. I don't understand any of these, how those objective standards are being presented, but then immediately saying, but, you can take it to the home next to me. I've been here so long. It was a period, Rob would know, the period in the late 70s when people were trying to maximize square footage in Hermosa to take advantage of the fact that our property values were lower than Manhattan, so that we could build a 3,000 square foot home here for significantly less than Manhattan. And we built some stucco boxes. I won't name the developer, he built them all over the South End. We had a planning commission member said, finally, in exasperation, she said, that's an ugly building. We need some articulation. And the solution, and Rob would know what the technical term is, we got 2-inch stripes, troughs in the stucco in geometric patterns that broke up the facade. It says in here someplace we have to change building materials every 10 feet, I think it is, or 30 feet, whatever it is. Did that do it? That painted band, is that? And again, then it comes to Miss Naughton, Director Naughton, and she has to make a determination. I'm still struggling. Give me a set of objective things. If we don't want dingbat apartments like the example that was presented, then tell me we can't have a, whatever that is, a 10-foot, 20-foot blank wall. Got it.
So if I could, because I think some of your comments are about the standards, I just want to kind of describe the modification process, and then we can look at the standards and,
But
discuss.
Martha, my point is the standards that would be appealed are 100%, as far as I can tell, subjective aesthetic decisions. I don't understand. It's one thing to say we're going to go to the director with a minor modification. We do that all the time. Minor modification is they moved the dance floor from the right side of the building to the left side. But now you're telling me that she wants to have a molding that's an inch wide or none, like a lot of the homes that have glass block windows. They have no, they're neither
Right.
raised, they're whatever. That's an
So-
aesthetic decision,
Correct.
purely subjective aesthetic decision.
Correct. So the objective standard is to provide 2-inch trim or a 2-inch recess.
Right.
So that's objective.
But purely arbitrary.
And it's objective. It's something that you can measure. You might not think that's appropriate. It's totally fine. I'm just trying to answer your question that you
Right.
said you're struggling with, is trying to
Right.
understand what is objective and what is subjective. So
Right.
the objective piece is the 2-inch trim or recess.
Right.
But then somebody said, hey, I have this streamlined modern house that I want to keep that architectural style, and that really doesn't make sense to have that. Or, my house, it makes sense to have the 1-inch trim. They can say, hey, can I get a modification to the objective standard? The modification is subjective. So the modification is subjective, but the standard is objective. And if you meet the objective standard, there's no subjectivity. The director can't say, yeah, I know that the standard says 2-inch, but I would like you to do 3. The city can't do that. If somebody meets the objective standard, then you go on your way. But if you desire to have an alternative to that design or that objective standard, if you don't want to meet that objective standard, you can request a modification. And that is subjective. You are right.
And I guess my question would be that, again, why have the standard at all?
You don't need to. That's exactly what I said. When we go through the standards, we'd like to hear from you, which, if
Okay.
any, of these standards are appropriate.
and as finish, but as I'm saying that, I'm wondering if staff can be thinking in the back of their minds, what are the things that we currently list as we don't permit? We don't permit, I hope we don't permit barbed wire fences. We don't permit chain link. I don't think we permit unfinished concrete block walls. I don't think we permit corrugated, whatever you call that, roofing.
And
There are a handful, Bob probably knows better than I, a handful of other things like that. Are there other things that we can all agree on the objective standards? And I appreciate Martha's explanation there. We don't want blank walls of more than fill in the blank, but I get concerned when, again, the standard by which we are going to, it needs to be very, very precisely articulated. In other words, does that 2-inch, whatever they call that, stucco mold count? Or does it have to be 3 feet? I don't want to do that. That's not, and yeah.
Can we just,
I appreciate, Martha, for your clarification. I
Well,
think I'm starting to understand.
Mr. Chair.
Yeah.
Next week.
yes,
I completely agree with Commissioner Hoffman on this point. Honestly, I think that the projections, the recesses, the 2-inch molding and so on is too much. It's far too much. And I think we should approach this in a manner in which Mr. Hoffman has suggested here. That's it's not what we want this, we want that, and it has to have this and it has to have that. It's what we don't want, I think. It's a much freer, much open, more open way of designing the buildings. As a builder, I've been here for 50 years in Hermosa Beach as a builder, and I've remodeled and built dozens of houses in Hermosa Beach. And I've had clients that have a 60s house or building, apartment building, and they love that 60s look to it. It's got a flat roof, it's got aluminum windows. Well, some of those things can be modified, of course, and updated to, but they don't want a 2-inch trim around the windows, and they don't want this thing and that thing. And I have to agree, that should be up to them to decide what they want. And if they want to have a chain link fence, then that's another thing. That's what I say. I think your approach, Mr. Hoffman, is more more doable. I think it's when you write this and you say, this is what we don't want to do. Nobody likes to look at a shoebox building that's a huge square stucco thing with no windows and no articulation at all. But to say that you must have articulation every 10 feet and you must have a change in material, or you must have some 2-inch molding and so on and so forth, I think that's far too much. It's gone overboard in the other direction. I think that, again, we should be much better if we went to a list of things that we don't want rather than things that we do.
let me just kind of jump back to, in a perfect world where we agree on our standards, is this a good modification process? I just want to focus on this. I mean, I know we've had debate on, is it objective, subjective, this, that. I look at this, I think it's fairly clear. When I look at sort of the discretionary action piece in the middle, it could add, 1 to 3 months to a project. That's probably the big difficulty of it. Maybe I'm in the minority here. I think this is a reasonable modification process if we, in fact, as a group, agree on what the standards are. And so I just want to get comments first on the modification process. If you think the modification process should change or in some way, I'd love to hear comments on that first, and then we'll get to the 2-inch molding. But I want to first talk about this one and give Martha some
Sorry, Chair.
feedback on
We
it.
really want to get it to the design standards. You can see.
I understand. Yeah.
But thank you for bringing us back into the proper spot in the meeting, which is the modification process. So I would agree generally with you, Chair, that the concept is laid out in a way that makes sense. My questions at the last meeting and tonight's meeting continue to be, what is the timeline? What are the application costs? What will the response time be from the director? Because I don't see any additional language that shows it would be anyone but our community development director approving the modification. And who would be the decision maker if you're out of town, you're otherwise engaged, you're offsite at meetings, and what's the appropriate response time to the modification process? Is there a limit to the number of modifications you would see for no charge for X amount of dollars? So mine are more administrative, and I don't know whether Martha, we would get to that later when we're in that next piece. But generally, the modification process makes sense to me. I just have some questions around how it's actually going to work for staff as well as any applicant, be it residential development or commercial. So those are my comments for right now on the modification process only. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, yeah, and I assume that the gist of this is that if someone is meeting the spirit, though not the letter of the law, there are some sort of difficulties that make their, wall 11 feet instead of 10 between, like whatever, it's, given the particulars of that property and what they're doing, as opposed to just sort of asking for a little more. So that, to me, this is a reasonable modification process. There's some more details need to be added, but does anyone else have any thoughts on that? I'll go first to the vice chair and then to.
Thank you, Chair Peterson. I would support the process as written and would add in, of course, the second Commissioner Rice's thoughts and yours as well.
Pete?
My question, I guess, when the director was explaining the public process, in other words, notification, my response is, so now I've got a notification within 200 feet that the person next door has asked for a modification. What's my recourse, or how do I, as a public member, be involved?
And again, this can be designed by the Planning Commission. This is just kind of to lay out an example type process that could be set up, and we would delve into the details once we get into the administrative section. But in past jurisdictions where I've worked, that we do send out notice, and then if you receive that notice, you have 10 days to provide comment. So if you believe that the proposal, once you go online, you take a look at the staff memo that's been written for it, you take a look at the plans, and you look at that analysis and the recommendation by the staff to the director. If you have objections to that, then you could submit your comment letter directly to the department. And then the department would take that into account. Are we receiving a lot of support for this? Are we receiving a lot of objections? Are we not hearing anything at all? Then at that point, that would all be taken into consideration. A determination would be made. And then an additional notice of decision would be sent out to that same mailing radius. And at that point, that would begin the appeal period. But again, that's just an example of how other processes have worked in other jurisdictions. We can certainly modify that. I would anticipate that we would take in an application fee. Applications like this would be for alterations that are big enough to not be able to fit very cleanly into the objective design guidelines, excuse me, but small enough that it's not a full public hearing that has to come before the Planning Commission. So really just a way to set up a more efficient review process than having to come before the Planning Commission. That being said, it would still set up a longer timeline. So once we receive an application, I would anticipate no longer than 30 days before we would post those materials online with the staff report, the notices to be sent out, things like that. So an applicant still would be looking at about 2 months in terms of timeline before the end of that appeal period is ended. And if any building permits are required, applicants are free to submit at risk during that appeal period, knowing that, there's a potential that it could be appealed. And if we were to go this route, any notification with the radius mailings would require a fee. And we would want to take in a fee to cover staff time and costs. But again, I would see those fees as being less than an entitlement that would require a public hearing. Although there still would be those costs if we sent out 2 different mailings to the radius mailing.
Okay, fair enough. Does anyone have additional comments on modification process? Rob? Yeah,
Mr. Chair, thank you.
Commissioner Seaman.
So this, I guess, maybe a question for Jeannie right now. The way things are currently, you submit a set of plans, apply for permit to do a project. Let's just say it's a single family residence. There is a design criteria that we have now in existence that this you have to meet these parameters. It's got to be this high and this tall and so on. You want to modify that. And so currently, what do? You go to you or the office or the planning department, I guess, and ask, I want to modify the requirements in such and such a way. Is that even possible the way things are right now? There is no modification process now. Is that correct?
Well, in terms of aesthetics only or in the development standards?
Well, in these things we're talking about here, the design standards.
Well, there's currently no, for a single family residential, there's no specific design review that is conducted. Any type of design review that we would bring an application before the planning commission. The closest to that would be the precise plan of development for the multi-unit properties and non-residential. So at this point, there's not a specific objective design review that's done for new single family.
So when we look at these design things that we're talking about, the 2-inch molding and so on and so forth, that's what people would want to come in to make a modification to. Because now we don't have any of those. So there is no modification process.
That's correct. And if an applicant were to submit or want to modify any of the development standards, then that would trigger currently in our code, like a variance or any other type of formal entitlement that would have to come before the planning commission.
Which would go to the planning commission.
And I'll go ahead and turn it over to Melanie Hall as well to add. some
Yeah, I just wanted to provide some brief clarity of what planners check for, say, for example, a single family resident. We don't currently have design standards, but what we're plan checking is the development standards. So that's the height, the setbacks, encroachments, open space, lot coverage, basically those development standards. So that's the first half of this document, the district standards. The modification process would be specifically for the design aesthetic elements. And those, we'll talk about in a little bit, but if you have any questions on the plan check process, we're more than happy to discuss that.
So I guess the point I'm trying to get to is that the modification process comes hand in hand with these design standards.
So if we were to do these design standards, they would still be in addition to the district standards. So we'd still have district standards. We'd still have the setbacks. We'd still have lot
Yes,
coverage.
that's different.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So these would be in addition to.
Right. So, okay. So the modification process that we're discussing here, it does indeed go with the design standards, because the other standards we have, setbacks, height limits, and so on and so forth, there really isn't much modification to that. You can, you can ask for it and go through a variance or an extension or something.
That's correct.
That's
Yeah.
a whole different, kind of a different process, different story.
That's correct. Yes, the process to modify the district standards like setbacks, open space and all of that, that would be through the variance process.
Okay. So if we were to say that we didn't really want to do these design standards, something more along the lines of what Commissioner Hoffman suggested, where we don't say this is what we want, but this is what we don't want, then this modification process would be sort of not needed. Is that correct?
That would be correct, but I'd refer back to either Pat or Martha if that would be consistent with the state law and those that we're trying to implement. So this,
Sorry, say that again. This is regarding state law.
yeah, so there's certain state laws that require cities to develop objective standards, whether those objective standards, as the planning commission, you get to recommend those standards. They're not set in stone, even what we've recommended, but there are state laws that require, the greater transparency and those objective standards.
State law requires us to have some design standards. Is that what you're saying? Maybe I
Objective standards.
Maybe I
Right, no, so Melanie is accurate in terms of certain state laws, and then once again, this is kind of related to the housing crisis. Basically say, hey, if you want to have any type of standards, they must be straightforward and objective, i.e. non-discretionary. This is for very specific types of projects. This is not a holistic kind of citywide thing. And Melanie, correct me if I'm wrong, that's what you're getting at, correct? This idea that, hey, for some of these specific housing development projects, state law says if you want to have standards, they must be objective and clear.
Yes, thank you, Assistant City Attorney Donegan. They're for very specific projects. These new housing laws do not apply to single family residential development, for example. I would just add for the commission's benefit that I think it's important to keep in mind or maybe separate between single family residential development and multifamily and commercial development. Objective design standards do become important when we're talking about commercial development or even multifamily, only in that they do provide a level of assurance to anyone who's looking to develop that property that they're not going to be stuck in a long, vague discretionary process with a jurisdiction. So it gives them a higher level of confidence in knowing what they can and can't build. But it also gives the city the ability to ensure that in our commercial corridors, for example, we have high quality development and a real sense of placemaking in the city. So if it's the commission's desire, you could look at separating out requiring more objective design guidelines for multifamily residential and commercial and leave single family as it is. That's completely up to the commission.
Okay, although on this report, this presentation, single unit development, there are the moldings and projections and so on. Multi-unit development, not nearly as many, but there are some design standards. And then, of course, commercial development is different, and multi-unit development. Commercial development has quite a few different ones.
Can I just jump back? Sorry to interrupt Commissioner Seaman, but this modification process, is there consensus up here, general consensus that at this level of review that this is a fair process or desirable process based on what's been presented? I think that's the consensus. That's different than liking the standard, but to the extent that we come up with standards, does this seem like a good working direction for staff to continue to pursue and drill down within the context of having standards? Is that their general consensus? Okay.
Maybe the consensus,
yes.
it's not the unanimous consensus.
Okay. Who thinks this is acceptable to move on? I know I do. Okay, we've got 3, which is not to the exclusion of the 2. If you could change something, I'll look to Pete first and then Rob, what would you change? Or is the objections you voiced earlier seem to be about the standards and having 2-inch molding versus 1 inch, or what the?
Well, but
that's what I'm trying to get.
Let me go back to this.
Okay.
Example, a modification to the building interest that may be approved for alternative designs that create a welcoming entry feature facing the street. With all due respect, Director, you and I may disagree on what is a welcoming feature. If I would like to have Mr. Dunn's property, he would like to have a security gate at his entrance, behind which his front door is not visible to the street. Is that welcoming or not? And I have a feeling she and I would disagree. And if I'm the contractor, that does me or the property owner no good at all.
But just for a second, just on concept.
But I'm saying.
But take away what someone's bringing to the modification
Then
process.
no, I don't believe the process is appropriate.
Process or this process?
This process, which puts this much pressure on the director to make determinations about the aesthetics and the character of the community on her own based on purely subjective or arbitrary standards.
But it says she may refer the application to the planning
Planning
commission.
So you think it all should come
Same
to?
Then we've created, then why are we putting that step in there? And I don't really want to see this come constantly to us. I don't want to be, I made this clear consistently. I don't want us to be an art jury.
I agree.
And that's the danger in all of these.
So you,
I agree.
so do
And
you,
without the standards, we don't need the modification process.
So there is that too.
so do you, Pete, do you have a recommended change in language to this,
No,
or you just
I
don't
haven't.
like it?
Thought what would be the appropriate way to do this.
Okay,
Most cities, and the director probably has a board or a committee, a commission that does this. I don't want that in Hermosa Beach. That's not how we got the city. I believe it was referred to by both of our pre-speakers, the eclectic architecture, which is decided. That's not how we got that. We didn't get it by prescribing what people need to do. We got it by, and as was brought up, I'm not worried about somebody that bought $1.5 million property, whether they're building 2 condos or they're building a home, that they're going to build a cracker box in this environment. That's not going to happen anymore.
okay. In the interest of time, I think we have,
We've got a consensus that we're.
well, I think we have a consensus
well, we
that
don't.
we're not in consensus. No, but I mean, I think Martha, certainly, we haven't economized on words here. I think you understand where we are. There's some difficulties. And I think some of those will be made more clear as we go through the design standards, including potentially separating out single family from other. So,
Yes, I feel like there has been enough input that we could move on to the other, to the
okay,
standards.
that's a polite way of saying uncle. Let's, I totally agree. Let's move on to this. Again, we have single family, we have multi-unit. Noted that there was a public comment on separating out 1 to 4 multi-unit versus 5+. We also have commercial. How would it be most beneficial for us to give you feedback? I'm thinking maybe we start with single unit development, whether we need that or not. Let me just kick off a question here. What, if you just drove around town, specifically just single unit development, homes that have already been built, what percentage would comply with the standard anyway? 90%? I'm sort of looking at Martha's postage sent little image there, but if anyone else wants to weigh in on the question of the day, I mean,
I'm sorry, you're asking how many?
wouldn't
the
most,
existing homes?
even if we didn't have the standard, wouldn't most of them meet it anyway? So is it just sort of a,
Are you asking how many of the existing single families in Hermosa would apply to these standards?
would meet that anyway?
I'd say very few of them.
You
I
don't,
don't put a number on it.
you don't think most of our homes would look like that? There's 3.
No.
Chair Peterson?
Yeah.
I don't feel like staff can give a percentage, but I do want to say that all of the examples here are from Hermosa Beach.
I'm sure there are some,
Yeah.
obviously.
I recognize
them,
one.
yeah.
I'm just trying to get a sense of how, I know there's concern about single unit development. I was just giving sort of the polling question there to kick it off. Does anyone have thoughts on this? Is it necessary? I know we got a couple of voices that it's not,
Could
makes
I-
sense, but yeah.
Could I
Martha?
make an observation? What I
Yeah.
feel like I've heard from most people that have spoken was apprehension about 1 and 2 building entrances and window trim, but that maybe the articulation or the limit on blank wall may be all you need.
I'd agree.
That's a reasonable statement, I think.
Wow,
So-
all right. Building a movement here. So number 3, how, and does everyone feel stated as it is, or are there dare I say modifications to how number 3 is, well, articulated, stated?
My only concern would again be that when this becomes actually codified, that we make very clear things like change in material. How much of a change? Indy left 1 row of bricks. Is that sufficient to break up the asphalt, or does it need to be 20 feet of brick? Does it mean that stucco mold is enough, or does it need to be a percentage or something.
A noticeable change in material.
Yeah, well, I don't.
No, I hear
know, but
you. Yeah, it's
But
like
my
there's-
concern again becomes that it becomes subjective and we're constantly putting this on the staff's lap does this represent that dimension or not?
Okay, that's a
I
fair
can make-
comment,
Yeah.
Vice Chair.
Do we have to go into a description of what that means, change in material? Does it have to be a change between stucco and wood? And list those things, for instance, to make it clear that we're not talking about a row of bricks or metal trim or change in color. You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah,
And
totally.
at what point do we draw the line on that?
That's why we're here.
That's
Yeah, yeah.
right.
What do you think?
Chair Peterson, there was earlier some comment that perhaps we should state what we don't want. And we don't want, for example, a huge, long stucco wall the entire length of the structure, whether it's commercial or residential. But I think accenting the positive, I think articulation to me, I think that's much better than saying what we don't want. This is very specific and it gives you a bunch of options. And I think they've got some good examples there. So I think articulation is really perhaps all we need. As opposed to, we don't want a big, huge stucco wall.
Got it. All right, Commissioner Rice.
Chair, I agree with Vice Chair. I think we can delete draft standards on building entrances and window trim and recess and leave the articulation as written. If we need to be more clear about how much of a change in material or percentage, I mean, that's something I guess we could discuss later. But
I agree.
generally, number 3, I think, Martha, you got us right to where we're going. So thank you.
All right. What I'm hearing is that, yeah, again, there's, dare I say, consensus to eliminate 1 and 2, to keep in articulation, but to have some additional language that provides, good faith compliance with the change in material if that's their chosen method of articulation. At this stage of development, we're going to have a couple more hearings, votes, discussions on this. So if y'all
Mr. Chair,
could
just
come
one
back-
quick comment also,
yeah.
and maybe this, Martha, is just, it's meaningless, but as I read this compared to the previous example, in the previous example, I believe it said 1 or more of the following. This you made it or
Oh,
I'd go back to 1 or more of the following.
yeah, it was just trying to not
Right, I
have
didn't know whether
as
you would, right.
limit words on my slide.
I appreciate that. Thank you. Excuse me.
Okay, right. I think we have clear direction for Martha and staff on that. Thank you, everyone. Moving on to multi-unit development.
So the standards for multi-unit actually go on to 2 slides. So there's 1 to 3 on here, and then there's articulation and curb cuts on the next slide. So I just wanted to make sure you're aware.
Okay, very good. Who would like to weigh in on this? I see Commissioner Rice.
Well, Chair, should we go with what, should we start at where we agree? And maybe we'd get to it. So for me, 4 and 5, because they relate back to what we were doing for single family, that makes sense to keep 4 and 5. We know how we feel about window trim and recess. I think where I have questions, and I'd like to hear from my colleagues, is on building length and building entrances. We do like entries to have some kind of emphasis. So I see merit to that, but I'm interested in hearing what my colleagues think on 1 and 2. Thank you, Chair.
Okay. Right. Yeah, I'll weigh in on those. I mean, I think, yeah, specific to 4 and 5, I agree with your thoughts on that. Window trim, I'm not, wed to that. In terms of building entrance, this is where I think the comment from the gentleman earlier in public comment specific to size of development. I mean, 2 to multi-unit development is different if it's just a few versus like 5+. So maybe we want to make a change there. So for building entrances for larger developments, I think that's probably there's more land there that's more appropriate than say a duplex or a fourplex. Specific to building length, again, I'm trying to think of what a 200-foot long building is in this town, or the need to make a building that's longer than 200 feet. I kind of like it as stated, but just one guy. Who else has a thought on that? Or thoughts on that generally?
Mr. Chair.
Yeah, Commissioner Seaman.
So on 1 and 2, building entrances, I cannot see why the building entrance must face the street. That just doesn't make sense to me. I've built many buildings and some multi-unit buildings, and it's nearly impossible sometimes to have every single entrance to every single unit face the street. It just doesn't make sense to me. So I would like to see that changed. Principal entry shall be emphasized with a projection recess. That's again something that sometimes it can be done and sometimes it can't be done. And I'm not sure if that really needs to be a requirement that they are emphasized with a projection and a recess and a landing and so on. So 1, I maybe eliminate 1 altogether. Building length, most of the lots in Hermosa Beach are pretty much limited to 125 feet. How do you build a 200-foot building in Hermosa? I don't think there's any place you can, unless you buy 2 or 3 lots and somehow put a 200-foot wide unit,
How long is Marlin Equity?
I'm sorry?
How long is Marlin Equity?
I don't know. I live about half a block from it and I don't think it's anywhere near 200 feet.
That would be commercial.
Are you talking about the one on Loma?
multi-unit.
Yeah, and that's commercial. First of all, we're talking about multi-unit.
No, I'm talking about Manhattan Avenue, the one that's under construction right now.
Oh, I have no idea.
That's got to be 200 feet plus. I'm just guesstimating.
Residential units that side would have to be the ones down in the south end, the mooring and those. that
Yeah,
have
there are
lower
some.
dimensions, but
Yeah.
that comes back to the question of an entrance where they have lobbies as opposed to a single entrance, even for the ground floor units. What's there is yards typically along the street.
Mhm.
So I'm not sure that works. Units must have an entrance facing the street.
And then as far as number 3 is concerned, we're back to the window trim and so on, which I think we should eliminate number 3. And then probably just eliminate all of number 1. And 4 and 5, articulation again is, a reasonable thing. We don't want to build shoeboxes. That's absolutely correct. Curb cuts, I have a question about that. Occasionally, there are curb cuts that if you were to put a new curb cut in, you would actually result in creating more street parking than what you had. Perhaps the existing building had a double driveway and you could put the parking in the back with a single entrance. And so you make a new curb cut and that would create an extra parking space, which I think is admirable and that's what we should be doing. So I don't have any problem. A new curb cut should be prohibited, except if an equivalent curb cut is replaced or there is no existing curb cut. And I would like to add to that, or if it results in more street parking. I think that's a reasonable thing to add to that particular part.
We're going to get to that level. We also have to be cognizant there are some one-way streets with no parking on one side, in which case new curb cuts don't affect on-street
Wouldn't make any
parking at all.
difference. No, that's very true.
So there needs to be an exception or something as that's codified.
Yeah, I agree. So those are my thoughts on a multi-unit development. Eliminate 1, eliminate 3. Building length, I don't know, 200 feet if that's possible to do. I suppose that's okay. And then 4, the articulation is the same, and then some modification to curb cuts on 5. Thank you.
Okay. Who else wants to? Vice Chair, do you have additional thoughts on this?
I do not on this.
Okay, Pete?
I think I covered it. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm hearing unanimous support with maybe some slight tweaks for items 4 and 5. I'm hearing a desire to remove item 3. I'm hearing a general agreement to keep in the building length, item 2. The number 1 building entrances, I'm actually kind of okay with how it's written because it's maybe there's some slight tweaks, but for a large multi-unit development, I think there's land and ability to, I'm just not sure what the alternative would be. So if we didn't have that, we would say that the principal entry could just be extremely plain with no projection, recess, or landing. And it's not requiring all units to have an entrance facing the street, just all units facing the streets or accessed by a walkway or stairway. I don't see the harm of number one. I think it pushes in a direction of, street facing. Maybe there's some safety for that in terms of having entrances on a lit street or through a principal entryway as opposed to sort of up the side of the building. What I know Rob doesn't like it. Where's everyone else on that? Or one, yay or nay?
Chair, I'm fine with keeping number 2, I think,
Okay.
because while we're saying that there aren't a lot of places where we could have a 200 foot long building, I think we probably want to then send the signal that we don't want lots to be joined to create it. So while it can exist now, we're also saying we don't want it to exist by any other means. So I'm for keeping number 2. And then within building entrances, Chair, you make a good point. It does bullet 1 under building entrances says it must have a entrance facing the street or access via a walkway or stairway from the street.
Right.
So does that for you, Rob, sort of help that out? Because what other way would there be for those units along the street to be accessed? So for me, I think that balances it well. I do want some emphasis on the entry. I think I'm okay with the number 1 as written. Keep number 2, delete number 3, okay with number 4, and then number 5 with the on the curb cuts with the sort of the comments we made about those on one-way streets with no parking on one side, and Rob's point about if we add more parking by adding a curb cut, that would be allowed. So I think that's where I sit on multi-unit.
Okay. Steve, where are you?
Yeah, Chair Peterson.
1 and 2.
Yeah, okay, so on number 1, I have no problem with it as written. When I think there's enough flexibility there, using the example of the apartment buildings in the south end of town. They have a walkway that leads to the internal entrance. So I'm fine with that. I'm fine with number 2. Let's get rid of number 3. 4 is good, and number 5 with the addition of Pete's observations and comments.
Okay, sounds good. And Pete, just in terms of number 1, where are you on that? I'm sorry,
You know, again, I'm
run around in these a few
grappling
times.
with, and again, I think the general orientation is correct. I'm trying to visualize, there are some buildings in town that are, I'm going to say 6 units, whatever, condos that have a driveway down the center where the access is primarily from the driveway. There's a house immediately across the street from me, a condo. The rear unit is only accessible from their driveway. And it couldn't have been built any other way because it's not a through lot or any. So I'm just want to make sure we're not. Look, and I appreciate other approved through modifications. I don't have we want objective standards here, right? We need to be careful of that. And then the big units, not that I anticipate there will ever be any more big projects like the south end of town, although the state may mandate that eventually. The question becomes, if I have a single entrance lobby and all of the condos or all of the apartments are accessible, think of the Victorian. Does that meet this definition or not? I guess it does. I mean,
That would be the property on
that's
2300 Prospect.
behind
Lazy
the
Acres.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Acres, that old building.
Well, it does, because there's
It says a
a
street
standard
facing.
entrance on the front off of Prospect.
I guess so, okay, so,
So-
yeah, I guess I'm okay with that.
Okay, Martha, have we given you, I think we're pretty,
Yes.
pretty tightened up on this. All right, cool. Now we move on to commercial development, noting that there is a set of slides and concepts for the downtown zone and then one for other commercial corridors. So who would like to weigh in on this, or Martha, if you want to lead us through it? Can I just ask a question? You made some comments specific to placemaking in the downtown zone. Can you elaborate on what you meant by that and how that kind of ties in? I assume that speaks to sort of, open architecture in the front, or some sort of, integration or buffer between the two, or I don't know.
Yeah, and thank you. I also wanted to clarify, I didn't mean at all to insinuate that anybody developing here wouldn't want to do a very nice building and quality development.
Sure.
But there is, because there's just an element of the public realm being important in the area that the city wishes to create, of the character and the pedestrian friendliness of the commercial corridors, and how the public improvements tie in with the private improvements. There's that space where the public realm meets the private realm, and you want those two to work together. So you could absolutely have a quality building that is, has tenants, is busy, but it may have its entrance only to a parking lot in the back, and the front of it along Pier Avenue, they might not want to have a lot of windows into their space for privacy reasons or for their operation. But the city may say, no, this is an important, we're trying to create this pedestrian area where people walk up and down the street, and having that transparency into the buildings, having the regular entrances are important features of that, to create that, so when somebody's walking down the street, they want to continue walking down, or they want to go to the next shop front. So that's what I was trying to articulate, and staff may be able to better articulate it as well, but there's just that additional public realm factor to it that you wouldn't necessarily have in a single family neighborhood that the city isn't trying to attract people to and keep people there, and keep that kind of pedestrian orientation too. So there's a public interest as well, that needs to be balanced in with that private interest.
Okay, fair enough. I appreciate the additional clarification.
Helpful.
No, that's very helpful. Who has thoughts or comments specific to the non-residential development standards specifically for the downtown zone? And then we'll go to the other areas. We're uncharacteristically silent here. What the heck?
I generally agree with what Martha was just saying about the nature of our efforts to create a pedestrian-friendly downtown. We've seen with when you think of it, to remove some of our quote-unquote standards, and suddenly the streets are full of outdoor dining and so on. So I want to be as unrestrictive as possible. I generally am okay with the standards as she's provided them here. The one that troubles me though is the transparency thing. She just mentioned the example. I think all of us know we have examples on Upper Pier of office buildings that don't want to have transparencies and yet are mandated to have glazed windows. And they very successfully came up with a solution to that. We have other buildings in the commercial C1 zone where people have put reflective glass in windows, which completely, in other words, we need to go as we codify this, if we're going to dictate that there has to be a certain number of windows within on the ground floor in particular, we're going to have to go that next step and then dictate what would be the acceptable glazing in those windows. And then we just told someone who wants to have, I don't know, a clinic, a spa, those kinds of things where privacy is inherent in it. I don't know how we work around that. And we also have issues in town where a lot of those windows have become signage, even if it's not, it's pretty clear that so you've used the window space as a sign. And so that's the one, and I'm not suggesting that's a fault of what's presented to us here, but that's a really difficult problem to address as we try to dictate what these standards would look like. The rest of the, again, we've gone through the 200, now we're at 50. I hate to suggest that that's somehow an arbitrary thing. If you had two 30-foot buildings, somebody has to do the geometry for me, or you got two 30-foot lots and you got a door in the north end and the south end. Are we more than 50 or 30, how we resolve that? But in general, I'm comfortable with what's been proposed here. I would add, and I apologize to Martha, the insinuation was not that you would try to or believe people would be building undesirable, aesthetic, unpleasing. I just think it's almost the opposite now in this environment. And I use Mr. Newman without, he may disagree with me, but you look at what he's invested in his newest property at Manhattan Beach. Obviously, they care a lot about the design of the storefront. So I think that's the direction we're headed.
Okay, thank you. I mean, I'll just jump in the silence here. I mean, specific to Pete's comments on transparency, literally, I think that it's sort of, I would say there's been a desire to not have office on the first floor and to have, retail or restaurants on the first floor. So I think that combines very well with that. To your point on like perhaps med spas or salons, others. I mean, maybe there's other ways to get around that or have other privacy features within the building. But yeah, generally, I think it's well done. Any other thoughts on downtown zone, any other guidance that we can give at this point in the process to Martha or to staff?
Mr. Chair.
Yes.
I agree with Chair Peterson about the idea of not having offices on the first floor. Not making it a rule or some sort of restrictive point, but to encourage it to put the offices on the top, and that I think goes with the transparency. Your point, I think, is well taken. Other than that, I pretty much agree with everything Peter Hoffman said about most of these. This is fine. I don't see any problem with any of this. Thank you.
Okay. Vice Chair.
Chair Peterson, I'm fine with it as written.
Okay. Commissioner Rice.
Sure. Thank you, Chair. Fine as written, but do share Commissioner Hoffman's concerns about the coatings on the glass and it becoming signage, as well as privacy needed for certain types of business. So if we could find a way to differentiate that and make it clear, make it transparent about the transparency when the use is different than restaurant,
Right.
just regular retail.
But we need to be recognized that when we say offices where do we treat personal services?
Right.
And I think a lot of those increasingly need or want some kind of privacy or whatever. So that's an issue that needs to be addressed.
Okay, fair enough. Moving on to non-residential development, specific to other commercial corridors. This is our last topic, other than, of course, anything else. But does anyone have thoughts on this? Again, I think generally this is solid. Maybe a few things we can tweak, but I like the direction we're going. Does anyone else have any thoughts or feedback? Looking for a green button.
I would
Vice
concur.
Chair.
I would concur.
Okay. Anyone else have strong opinions one or the other? Feedback, thoughts? Again, this is a, gathering thoughts, consensus where we can get it, but just pushing the process forward and giving Martha some guidance. So Pete, do you have anything to add?
My only comment again would be back to, for example, in item D, while I'm absolutely in favor of not allowing parking in front whenever it's possible, I don't know where 40%, where that figure came from as a standard. I'd almost, I guess I'm just struggling with here. We're setting another standard that strikes me as a bit arbitrary, trying to think if I was going to redevelop the JAMA site, for example, depending what kind of a business it would be. 40, 60, but I like the idea. My intent is, and I'm sure Martha's intent is, that we don't want parking in front of commercial buildings as much as possible.
Fair enough. Martha, can you put some color as to the 40% versus more or less, or what other cities use?
Well, we tried to look at the typical lot pattern in Hermosa, although every kind of lot is different, and come up with a number that, yeah, really kind of had allowed the parking either on the side or behind, but not in front. That being said, and that's the number that we kind of tested and used in these schematics. That being said, there isn't one magic number that's exactly kind of right. We can look at 30%, we can look at 35 and test some different numbers and see if those would come up with a similar result with a little more flexibility. But Commissioner Hoffman's exactly right. It's trying to define that standard that places the parking on the side or behind. But we can certainly look at 30%, 35. I think lower than 30, then you're just really, the parking area can be overwhelming, I would say. So. Oh.
Well, you're not changing the total amount of parking with this dictate. You're just pushing it more to the back, correct?
Right, right. And you're hoping that the building has more of a presence at the street than the parking does. Is then
right. So if you're playing around with different schematics, what happens if it's 60 instead of 40, which would look better from a city standpoint? Does the model fall apart?
Well, it just gets hard to fit parking, and because of your lot pattern, right? You need a certain amount of width for the drive aisle and for the parking spaces. So if you go too small, it's just not feasible to put any parking on the side. So that's why we're at the 40, because to enable parking to be located on the side.
Okay, fair enough. That gives us some additional
My
understanding.
concern would be the opposite also. If we have a relatively small lot and we're on PCH where we're going to have relatively high-speed traffic trying to come in and we need a double driveway, 40 may be too much. In other words, on Mr. Dunn's lot, I don't know how wide his lot is, but where he is, if we made 40% of his property had to be, would that still allow him a reasonable drive for a tractor trailer to deliver a load of tile? I don't know.
All right, fair enough. Do we have any other comments on this item? I mean, I think we have general, I won't use the word consensus, but certainly buy into what Martha has proposed, what staff has put in front of us. Are there any other thoughts on non-residential development standards for other commercial corridors? I'm not hearing any. And then anything else?
Chair Peterson, I have 4 different observations on the preliminary draft of the district and design standards.
Okay, fair enough.
And you thought you were going to go home early. On page 13.
We've already hit the over, so take your time.
On page 13, pedestrian amenities on Pier Avenue, it says that one bench visible and accessible to the sidewalk shall be provided in conjunction with new construction or addition of 500 square feet or more, or the redevelopment of 500 square feet. As I was driving up tonight, I took a look on Upper Pier, and I'm not sure I would want any benches on Upper Pier. So I'd like to see maybe a little loosening of that language. And I'm not quite sure, Martha, how the loosening is, but there may be a situation where 500 feet is developed and right out in front, it's inappropriate for a bench. So if we could somehow have some language that loosens that up. On page 15, we talk about, and this is just a small editorial, not editorial, positioning fix, I think. Under beach, B at the bottom, it says this zone plans for existing and major planned public parks. I'm wondering if that sentence really doesn't belong up into the open space paragraph, which is the paragraph above. On page 16, supplemental regulations, I'm a little confused, but that happens a lot these days. On OS zone Noble Park, is this section only for Noble Park, or is it addressing a variety of things in other zones as well? And the reason I ask that is that on page 17, it talks about softscape, including grass, trees, plants, soil, flowers, shall be artistically designed to cover all of the Biltmore site. So I'm not sure what the Biltmore site is doing in this section unless this section is beyond Noble Park. I mean, it looks like it starts out originally only addressing items in Noble Park, but then it wanders into the Biltmore site. Again, just a small thing. Pardon?
It is Noble Park.
I believe those are synonymous, but
Oh, you know what I was thinking of? My apologies. I was thinking of the Keito Park down at the end of,
And that
never
would,
mind, strike that.
and
I-
actually,
You're absolutely right. Never
Vice Chair,
mind.
Vice Chair, back on your comment on the beach
Yes,
section,
yes.
on page 15, where you thought that beach B, the B zone, should be up in open space. Is that what you're sort of the crux of what you were saying?
No,
What, so I missed what you were saying about,
the second to the last sentence. This zone provides for existing and major planned public parks. Is the beach a planned public park? I'm just wondering if that's not referring to South Park and Keito Park. And I'm just wondering why that sentence is there when we're talking about the beach. Unless the beach is a planned public park. If it's a planned public park, then it's fine being there.
now I understand your question. Thanks.
I mean, maybe it should be there. I just don't know the answer. I'm just pointing it out. My last item, page 34, trip reduction and travel management. I think that's a wonderful idea, but do we really want to be mandating our businesses to do that? We do. I'm getting a nod from a commissioner saying, yes, we do. Hmm? Well, the state does.
yeah.
All right, that completes my comments then.
All right, fair enough. Okay, does anyone else have anything else? Okay, hearing a lot of silence. I think at this point we're done unless the director or staff has anything else for us. If I could entertain a motion to adjourn, and then we'll see everyone. Feel free.
Now that we're meeting in person, do we have to continue to do roll call votes on simple procedural items? Or can we
You know,
just go back to voice votes like we used to?
Yeah, I would say for ending the meeting, a voice vote would likely be fine, but however, due to the hybrid, it's still required to have the
Is that
voice
right?
vote for any, formal action.
Okay. Fair enough.
Okay, do I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved?
Second.
Okay, can I get a voice vote? All those in favor?
Aye.
Call for a roll call. That'd be more fun.
All right. See you in 8 days. Thank you, everyone. Appreciate your help. Thank you.